All right. Welcome back to the show. This is your host, Young Brando, live from Los Angeles. We are experiencing an interesting moment in the auction circuit and on the secondary market for watches, sorry about that, for vintage watches especially. Um, I covered this story, uh, the first, if not one of the first, on YouTube. Yesterday, I shared some important information through the article of Neue Zürcher Zeitung that reported on a vintage Omega Speedmaster that never was. This was a piece that sold for more than 3 million Swiss francs in November 2021, which was by far an absolute record for an Omega wristwatch. In April, Periscope, Jose Perez, who does very important work in the watch community, published an expose on his blog that unearthed some very important pieces of evidence, which raised some crucial questions about the alleged origins of this watch, which put its presentation as a one-of-a-kind early example of an Omega Speedmaster broad arrow with a very attractive and warm patina. As I've covered yesterday, the June 1st dated article from NZZ exposes many details about this watch and presents a number of allegations that involve a global scandal with actors, with alleged actors, including a few watch dealers globally, a prominent auction house, and even collaborators within the Omega corporate body itself. Most importantly, perhaps, we have touched upon responses from Omega's CEO, Reinhard Eschlimann, who was pretty incensed in a professional way, of course, and whose statements pretty much targeted those who were allegedly involved in this particular matter. And he said in as many words that Omega has every intention to make this into a legal case and bring everyone involved to justice, since this was a matter that genuinely hurt Omega, that genuinely embarrassed the brand, because they were, in fact, very much encouraged, quite exuberant about the result, to the extent that they made a press release in haste, which included a few misspellings and other mistakes. So now we have another article by NZZ, by Neue Zürcher Zeitung, which adds another fold to the story of the record-breaking vintage Speedmaster that never was, the Speedmaster that was discovered to have been what we call a Frankenwatch, a patchwork of original parts, other Omega parts harvested from watches that come from later periods, and even allegedly forged elements that modified the movement of the watch to fit the dial, to fit the narrative that this was a piece which came from the first series of the Omega Speedmaster in 1957, 1958. The Speedmaster was, of course, to become a legend in its own right. The Moonwatch acquiring this cult status by being involved in the Apollo mission and being worn in the first moon landing in 1969. Hi, JJ. How are you doing, man? So today we're talking about the June 2nd article by Neue Zürcher Zeitung, which actually introduces us to the buyer. This is very funny. And look, we left the last live stream at an important point, and it was really a question. How do we restore a climate of trust on the secondary market of vintage watches at this juncture where a lot of important collectors have become cynical about the process, have become quite mistrusting for all the right reasons, and have turned their back for the most part on collecting vintage watches? How do we amplify the voices of people like Periscope, people like Jose Perez, who actually do the groundwork in uncovering, in exposing such alleged forgeries and other kinds of funny business? How do we increase the number of people who do this kind of work? And how do we provide a platform so that we can, as the collectors community, at least put the fear of God in the hearts of these kinds of scammers so that they don't dare engage in these kinds of conspiracy? Again, we are going back to the second article, which is dated June 2nd, coming from Zurich, Neue Zürcher Zeitung, which is the German newspaper of record in Switzerland and one of the most prestigious German language newspapers more broadly. They are presenting this piece with the title, "A Surprising Turn in the mystery surrounding the millions worth but Frankenwatch of that vintage Omega Speedmaster." It is now clear who actually bought in the Geneva auction this forged or falsified vintage Speedmaster. It was Omega themselves. So the buyer, who was purportedly from China, turns out to be Omega itself. Omega bought its own record-breaking vintage Speedmaster, which, at least in hindsight, turns out to be, at the very least, in the best, most charitable scenario, a patchwork of various parts harvested from Speedmasters of a number of distinct periods, and finally doctored with aftermarket parts to look like something that it isn't. The buyer, it turns out, is actually Omega itself, and now they have every intention of rectifying their mistake. So let's read on. The corporation states that it was actually fooled by its own colleagues, by its own employees. The involved parties were let go, were fired, and the brand is taking steps to make this into a legal matter. The article is once again penned by Andrea Martel in collaboration with Chanchal Beswas, who had actually supplied some information for the previous piece as well. In the curious affair around the Frankenwatch, that was the vintage Omega Speedmaster, sold in November 2021 in a watch auction in Geneva for the record-breaking price of more than 3 million Swiss francs. The traces now lead to the watch manufacturer from Biel themselves. Omega actually shared on Friday evening that the brand was itself the buyer of the watch that cost more than 3 million francs. The next subsection is called "The Director of the Museum Pleads for the Purchase." Now, I will bring also a relevant section from Jose Perescope's expose about the matter, the earlier April 2023 blog post, where he actually makes an assertion that both supports this claim to a certain extent, but also puts some of the statements here in doubt. I think the whole article and the narrative presented here presents as many new questions as it responds to, as it supposedly answers. And I think things are becoming more confusing than ever. Once again, we have already mentioned, and Omega admitted as much, that they are very embarrassed about this entire ordeal, that they have every intention to clear their name. They have every intention to come out in top about this matter that can become a debacle and scandal which is not good for the brand equity. So I'm reading everything with a grain of salt at this point, because we don't exactly know what happened. We never will, perhaps, but I think there are so many actors, named and unnamed, in these two articles who really need to be presenting their own stories as well, at least their side of the story. So the leader of the museum, the director of the museum, pleads for the purchase. The watch was actually, Andrea Martel writes, was bid on with the blessing of the brand by the director of Omega's museum. As Omega further explains, the museum director presented an argument that what was at stake was a Speedmaster from 1957, a very rare and extraordinary timepiece, which unconditionally belonged to Omega's question, which should unconditionally be included in Omega's own collection and needs to be bought at whatever price necessary, right? So Omega's own museum director presented a case to the brand, at least this is what Omega says, that this watch is a must-buy for Omega since it is a very rare, extraordinary, and early example of what has become the flagship of the brand. The article continues that the watch actually reached a hammer price of 3 million Swiss francs, bewildered the international community of watch enthusiasts and collectors. That was roughly 8 times as much as the most expensive Speedmaster up until that point, and around 30 times the estimated value published in advance of the auction by Phillips themselves. Generally, Martel continues, Martel and Biswas, I should say, continue. It is only vintage wristwatches of brands such as Rolex or Patek Philippe that reach such millions of prices under the hammer. The article continues, as the NZZ previously reported this week, the watch was, after all, not a rarity that was presented by the auction catalog. Rather, what was at stake was a timepiece that the forgers put together from a number of different watches as well as aftermarket parts. Martel and Biswas write, as the article points out, it was also 3 colleagues, 3 employees of Omega who took part in the making of this watch. Again, these are the allegations from the earlier Neue Zürcher Zeitung article. Among other things, they provided to their external purported accomplices internal information without which it would not have been possible to reproduce in a compelling way, in a convincing way, important parts of the watch. And that was specifically the bridge that carried the engraved serial number. According to the earlier article's allegations, it was an internal Omega actor who provided a period appropriate serial number to the dealer, who then, through an intermediary, brought the watch to the auction house. Without that correct, quote unquote, serial number, of course, it wouldn't have been possible to present this watch as a compelling piece that actually belonged to 1957 or 1958. Until Omega's Friday evening statement clarification, it was not entirely clear who would have bought at the auction this particular watch at this exorbitant price point. In the industry, people have spread the rumor, the article continues, that two immensely wealthy collectors bid against each other, but that was not a compelling story. That was not a credible story, according to the article. There were many more hints, the article continues, that there was a concerted action that pointed to unknown buyers. The article continues that Omega itself participated, bid on the auction, and through that actually was involved in producing a record-breaking price is in and of itself not extraordinary, nothing unusual. Quite to the contrary, it is a well-known secret in the industry that many watch manufacturers do in a silent manner. On the one hand, this is to bring back home some of these rarities. On the other, it is to foster, it is to cultivate, it is to maintain the prices for vintage watches and to awake by that the desires of rich buyers. So the article, I think, gives a very nice summary about the overlapping wishes, overlapping stakes of watch brands today that are involved in chasing after some of the most desirable vintage pieces earlier produced by them. They both want to enrich their own collections. The brands are increasingly more interested and invested in making museums that present, foster, and nurture their brand equity. And in the same manner, it is most certainly very crucial to foster the secondary market, and especially the vintage market, in preserving and furthering that brand equity, since vintage and contemporary actually is very much intertwined in the watch industry, and not only in the inspiration of designs that decorate today the catalogs of many, many brands with models that scream vintage inspiration. So we continue. It is not in and of itself extraordinary. The article says that brands bid on their own watches. This is, after all, both to enrich their own collections, bring back home some of the rarest pieces, but also to nurture the secondary markets, to foster the vintage markets, so that they preserve and, in fact, increase brand equity and draw the attention of some of the most illustrious and richest collectors. So the next section is titled "The Sellers Are Also the Buyers." The case of the Franken Speedmaster is, however, a little trickier. The three employees of Omega, among which we can count the director of the Omega Museum, were active on both sides of the deal. So this is the allegation, right? That is also put forward by Omega, and that Neue Zürcher Zeitung here rehearses. The three Omega employees, one of whom was the previous director of the Omega Museum, were active on both sides of the deal, were active on the seller side and also on the side of the buyer. Now, this brings me back to Periscope's first article about this whole ordeal. I'm going to drop the link in the chat so you can take a look at his website and specifically this article. But in that article, he has a very specific statement about this cheatmaster, as he calls it. I know for a fact that the Omega Museum was bidding on this thing as well, but they dropped out at around 600K. I'm not gonna belabor the point. I'm not going to elaborate. But months ago, it was already known that the Omega Museum was bidding on the watch, and it was most certainly with the brand's blessing. And the implication here is that the person who was bidding on behalf of Omega was told to drop out at around 600,000 Swiss francs. Whoever that person was, whether someone else was involved, I don't know any of these things, but I thought it prudent to share this detail, that it was already known that someone from within Omega, someone from within Omega with a relationship to the museum was bidding on the watch. They had the company's blessing, but they were told to drop out around 600,000 Swiss francs. The more recent narrative presents a different kind of information. And it says there were 3 Omega employees involved with the deal. They helped the sellers present the watch in a certain way, and they encouraged Omega to buy this purportedly rare, early, and exceptional piece at whatever price by any means necessary. So the NZZ article continues. That means, together with third parties, out of original and aftermarket parts, they have created a watch for which they doctored a clean genealogy, a clean provenance, right? We were just talking about how they made sure that the movement carried a serial number, which would be period correct with the presentation of the watch. Early example, 1957, 1958. So they have collaborated with third parties to create a watch out of original and aftermarket parts, manufactured or doctored for it a clean genealogy. And then with Omega's money, they have bought the watch themselves, in a manner of speaking, for an exorbitant amount of money. The very last article of the watch, the Omega, the watch manufacturer, and Phillips, the auction house, both emphasized that they are victims of organized criminal activity. Omega, with regard to their own findings, with regards to the information that they have at hand, will follow a legal path, will take the necessary legal steps against all those involved. Buenas tardes, Gidi. So we are looking here now at a multi-layered, multi-tiered alleged conspiracy. In the first place, we thought that we already had an international ring of alleged criminals, which included dealers from various countries of Europe, a prominent auction house, and a vintage Omega Speedmaster that never was, a Frankenwatch that was put together by shady professionals, in part out of original Omega watches and in part out of doctored aftermarket parts, which were manufactured for this process themselves. In the first place, Phillips acted surprised and only admitted to the fact that the bezel was changed, as well as the seconds hand, and that they have no clue and no one has told them or presented them with the facts that there were other parts and aftermarket parts involved. And at that time, let's remember that Phillips had said, and I don't know whether they were playing the fool or whether they genuinely didn't know, but in yesterday's article, they actually said that once they reach out to Omega, and they are doing so immediately, and once they achieve a certain clarity about the situation, they will, of course, talk to the buyer, right? So we are seeing again, at the time they responded to Neue Zürcher Zeitung for the June 1st article, they either didn't know that Omega was the eventual buyer of the watch, or they are playing stupid to pretend that Omega, whom they will contact for their information, and the buyer, whom they will later contact with that information, are different entities. That's very strange, if you ask me. The surprise they shared when Neue Zürcher Zeitung reached out to them with Omega's statements, that is curious. The confusion they present in this particular statement that belongs to the June 1st Neue Zürcher Zeitung article is quite curious, right? That we are going to contact Omega immediately once we reach a certain level of clarity. Then, of course, we will reach out to the buyer to talk with them. And together with the buyer, they say, pardon me, we will review these pieces of evidence and evaluate their consequences. And if necessary, we will undertake further investigations with regard to the authenticity of this watch. So this was Phillips's position yesterday. We have no clue what's going on. We knew the watch after the auction. We knew that the watch had a bezel that was changed and a chronograph seconds hand that was swapped out, but we had no clue about aftermarket parts or anything of that sort. And at that time, they were also saying, Omega didn't reach out to us, but now that you are sharing these statements with us, NZZ, we will immediately reach out to them. And we will also contact the buyer when we understand the situation to figure out how to take further necessary steps. So that to me is very confusing. Thank you, Shanda. Shamba Basher, thank you, 499. That's great. Yeah, you know, Thomas, that would be the biggest troll, right? Swatch should make a moon swatch that looks exactly like this watch. That would be the biggest way of saving face for them, right? Thank you so much, Shamba. You are more than welcome, my man. So yeah, I think it's extremely curious that Phillips would act first surprised, then confused, and then suddenly take the place of the victim in the course of a couple of days. I'm not implying anything by it. I'm just presenting the facts as they are shared with these two consequent articles by the Neue Zürcher Zeitung. I also find it not necessarily disconcerting, but I'm finding it myself quite curious that we have this conflicting information in terms of the narrative that unfolded on Omega's side, because there is the earlier rumor, which is a rumor, but more or less confirmed as factual, as compelling by a number of people within the industry, that Omega had every intention of bidding on this watch, that Omega tasked their own museum to acquire this watch, that they established a ceiling, a maximum bid at 600,000 Swiss francs, after which the museum actually dropped out during the bidding. So the questions that emerge from that conflicted narrative are, because the new article, the June 2nd article from Neue Zürcher Zeitung, basically says that the internal actors, that the 3 Omega employees that are allegedly part of this supposed conspiracy, were actually the ones who are really pushing for the purchase, who were really pulling for the purchase of this watch, and by whatever means necessary. So there's a certain discordance there. Was there more than one person bidding on behalf of Omega in this auction? If it was genuinely the Omega Museum that dropped out at 600,000, and I don't want to be snarky, but I will be, I think, and I'm sorry if Omega collectors and fans hate me at this point, but we know that Omega has certain connections to China in terms of their manufacture. But why was it recognized that the final buyer of the watch was someone from China, which is a piece of information that Phillips didn't contest, that Omega didn't put into question until yesterday evening? Did they just use the location as China to put on this fog of war into the situation, or was it just misinformation on the part of the investigative journalists who didn't actually confirm this with Phillips Auction House or even Omega in the first place? It's curious minds want to know. Curious minds want to know what it actually meant for the final buyer to be identified with China, Why was that necessary? Did Omega actually use someone based in or someone from China to bid on their behalf? Was that the only person who was bidding on behalf of Omega? There are so many questions, and Floodland has a very good point here. Blame the big bad guy, China, good diversion. Yeah, I mean, again, we are just asking questions here based on the facts presented to us by two newspaper articles, but also even earlier by the important work that Jose Perez, aka Periscope, aka Perestroika, who uncovered some important allegations about this particular watch that was sold back in November 2021 for an absolute record for an Omega wristwatch for more than 3 million Swiss francs. And not only was Periscope the first to present these allegations in a coherent manner, he also did that with a number of high resolution photographs that really home in to the details that identify the fishier aspects of this particular watch. So once again, I'm dropping a link to that initial expose, which you should check out. And I'm happy to answer any questions. If you have any watch-related questions or any questions regarding this case, regarding the two articles that were published on June 1st and June 2nd in the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, the German newspaper of record for Switzerland, feel free to ask them. I'm going to take a short break to grab a cup of water, but I will be back to answer your questions. All right, I'm back. For those who have just joined, please upvote. It really, really matters a lot for a channel of this size. Please share the video, share these two videos specifically on this case. We are talking about the record-breaking vintage Omega Speedmaster that never was. Yesterday, for the first time on YouTube, I covered the story from Neue Zürcher Zeitung, which shared their own investigations, but presented a report mostly based on Periscope's earlier April 2023 expose that already unearthed a number of important pieces of evidence which presented a very strong case that this Omega Speedmaster, an early and seemingly very charming vintage example of the broad arrow, was in fact Frankenwatch, as we call it in the collectors community, was in fact a patchwork of original Omega parts harvested from various pieces belonging to different eras, as well as aftermarket parts, specifically bridges of the movement, one of which was inscribed with a serial number that, in a falsified way, made the watch seem that it was in fact belonging to that early period, 1957, 1958. And of course, the important discovery in that initial article was that such a number could only be acquired by the dealer who presented the watch to the prominent auction house only through an internal accomplice from within Omega. And the initial article also included statements by Omega's own CEO, who made it quite clear that Omega had every intention to take the necessary legal steps to bring everyone involved to justice, because they considered it one, an absolute embarrassment, but also two, an alleged conspiracy that allowed a number of people not only to enrich themselves, but hurt Omega massively in the process. And at the time of that article, Phillips presented simply no official statements. I think that's still the case until now. They simply acted surprised, and they have only shared that after the fact, after the auction concluded, people let them know that the bezel and the chronograph seconds hand were replacements, but they have also shared that they had no idea that the watch involved in any way any aftermarket parts whatsoever, and that they would reach out to Omega for further information. And once they achieve a certain clarity about the situation, they will also contact the buyer to figure out what they can do about the situation. Today, we have discovered, thanks to Omega's own official statement that came out on Friday evening, and mainly to Neue Zürcher Zeitung's report based on the statement, that the buyer was actually Omega, that Omega itself bought the watch for more than 3 million Swiss francs, that they have not only fired the 3 employees who were suspected of this sort of involvement, but that they are also pursuing this as a legal matter, taking steps against everyone who is involved.
Because after all, these people are suspected to have not only enriched themselves in the process, but also hurt Omega as a brand. As it stands, both Omega and Phillips present themselves as victims in this situation. They are blaming basically an alleged international ring that includes dealers, that includes suppliers and watchmakers, that also includes allegedly employees from within Omega's corporate body who have basically created a watch out of thin air by pasting together, by copy paste of original parts and aftermarket parts, as well as some careful doctoring, not to mention by manufacturing a clean genealogy which presented the watch as an early example of an Omega Speedmaster with a broad arrow that left the manufacturer in the years of 1957 or 1958. The allegations also involve the idea that these internal people, these three Omega employees, actually presented a case within the brand, and Omega specifically identifies the museum director, whom they have later fired, and who is not named in any of these pieces, that this person presented a very strong case for the purchase of this watch, since it was such an early and extraordinary example of the brand's flagship, the brand's icon, that it needed to belong to Omega's own collection, and that it needs to be bought at the auction at whatever price by whatever means necessary. So Omega is essentially selling, my apologies. Omega is essentially presenting this story that they are the victims. Phillips is also acting surprised and confused. And according to the official statements of Omega, there are only these external actors and their internal accomplices who are to blame in this alleged conspiracy. Whereas when you look into Periscope's early expose, he has already shared in passing, yes, without going into much detail, yes, and I'm not going to elaborate on it too much either, but Jose Perez wrote in that April 2023 expose, I know for a fact that the Omega Museum was bidding on this thing as well, but they dropped out at around 600,000 Swiss francs. And this was something that was known within the collectors community. And again, we have mentioned time and again that it's not extraordinary, it's not unusual for brands to seek and to bid in public auctions on exceptional examples of their vintage watches or rare examples of watches they have produced in the past. And we have also heard earlier that the Omega Museum was involved in trying to acquire this watch, but that they were left in the dust because it suddenly moved into this exorbitant realm in terms of in the context of a bidding war. But this particular information, and this is something we knew earlier as well, because even the narrative in the first Neue Zürcher Zeitung article implied that Omega was involved in the bidding and basically were drowned out by the time the battle has surpassed the first million. So what to make of the conflicting aspects of that narrative? If the Omega Museum was bidding on behalf of the brand with the blessing of the corporate arm, and if they were given that ceiling, if their maximum bid was 600,000, and if they truly dropped out at that particular point, how did Omega end up buying this watch? Were there in that tent, because this was in 2021, remember, were there in that tent that was set in front of the Hôtel La Réserve more than one people, more than one bidder who was bidding on behalf of Omega? And if Omega is, after all, the eventual buyer of this piece, why was it identified for all this long as someone from China? Why is it the case that Neue Zürcher Zeitung didn't confirm that this was, in fact, the truth of the matter? Why didn't they ask Phillips and confirm that this was actually from China? If it was, in fact, a bid from China that finalized at the hammer, that became the buyer, what are the connections? What are the ties that bind that particular buyer from China to Omega? If it wasn't a buyer from China, why was it necessary to propagate that narrative? And why did we have to wait until yesterday evening of Omega? Why did we have to wait until yesterday evening for Omega's statements to actually find out that Omega themselves bought the watch? Would we have known anything about this debacle if it weren't for Neue Zürcher Zeitung's coverage? Because most people did not pay much mind or heed to Jose Perez's earlier expose. You guys know that I bring up Periscope on this channel quite a bit because I do a lot of auction coverage. So I think it's absolutely necessary to present a balanced view and present his important findings. just so you know how some of the rarest and most desirable vintage watches in the auction circuits can actually have these serious allegations regarding their authenticity, so that we take the necessary steps in not only identifying these forms of funny business, but also recognizing and also maintaining a certain state of mind where we always preserve healthy skepticism. But ultimately, I think the way that this situation has unfolded and the way the case continues to unfold in front of our eyes really teaches us the important lesson. Once again, how do we amplify the voices of people like Periscope, like Jose Perez, who are doing this kind of work, who are making these kinds of exposés, because seemingly before such information reaches um, a certain level of recognizability, a certain level of exposure, no one quite cares. And how do we increase the number of people like Periscope, like Jose Perez, who do this kind of work for the community? How can we encourage that? How can we build a community of experts, enthusiasts, and collectors who act as true watchdogs, as uninterested, uninvested, objective assessors, so that we can, as a community, put the fear of God in the hearts of these scammers, that they not dare in trying to take advantage of unassuming but well-intended collectors, because this is a problem that we all have to face and deal with. And we all, I think, have the responsibility and, most importantly, the desire to restore a climate of trust, of enthusiasm, of passion, rather than this increased mistrust and disillusionment when it comes to collecting, especially vintage pieces. Okay. Thank you for being with me. Thank you, Floodland, for letting me know. JJ, thank you for your upvote and your $5 super chats. Please share this video and let's raise awareness about this situation within the collectors community, because after all, this is not an issue that simply plagues a single company, a single watch, but a situation that actually concerns us all. Because after all, these kinds of alleged scandals and debacles are unfolding behind the scenes, and we never get to know them until they reach this level of exposure. So let's think together and let's work together so that we can get a hold of these kinds of information these kinds of exposés ahead of time, if possible. Let's support the work of people like Periscope, like Jose Perez, who has tirelessly in the last couple of years especially, but even before that, if I'm not mistaken, who has covered these kinds of allegations before, and in painstaking detail and with high resolution images that present very, very strong cases indeed. And how do we increase the number of these kinds of people so that we can actually make these scammers at least hesitate before they try to undertake these sorts of bad faith, concerted forms, organized forms of action that try to take advantage of unsuspecting and largely well-intentioned collectors? How do we restore a community that binds together around trust, friendship, and passion? This should be our goal. Hopefully, I'll continue reporting on this story, and hopefully I'll bring in some other people to present their perspectives. I look forward to seeing you again. Thank you again and again so much for your support. Thank you, Bezels, for your super sticker. Thumbs up. Thank you for the upvotes. And we'll be back with more information about this case and more thinking about how we can, in fact, restore this community to an even better state so that we can eliminate some of these people who are trying to take advantage of the collectors. I'll be back. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, wear your watches and enjoy them. Love you all. Can't wait to see you again on the next live stream. Please share the videos. Take care.